Hi, I'm Darren. Nice to see you again. Today I'm going to talk about something that's been hitting the press a bit lately in a lot of social media, pensions mis-selling. I'm seeing a lot of adverts from claims companies saying, have you been mis-sold a SIPP? And I just thought I'd touch on that and look at whether mis-selling is actually a problem. Now, obviously, I'm going to take this with a pinch of salt because you think I'm an advisor, I've got a vested interest. But I'm going to just go through it with you and you'll see why it's not as big a problem as you think. First of all, let's look at some numbers. The latest figures from the Financial Ombudsman Service, FOS, for 2019-20, and these have just been released, they're hot off the press. Total complaints about SIPPs amount to 2,606. That sounds a lot, but that's out of 250,000 complaints to FOS about various things. So it's a very small percentage. Of those, 166 complaints are actually resolved. That means complaints they've looked at properly and looked at whether there was a genuine case. Many of the cases of that 2,600 were dropped straight away when the client was not really complaining. It's not a genuine complaint. What they were asking was a query they didn't ask an advisor, and FOS have just responded and closed that down. So out of the actual complaints, they've resolved 166. Some are still ongoing, of course. And of that 166, 59% were given the outcome that they had actually had a problem and the complaint was upheld. There is also in the same area defined benefit transfers. That's your final salary schemes being transferred out. Obviously, a lot of that was hitting the press last year with regard to the British Steel chaps, etc. There were 64 complaints resolved out of the complaints they received. 42% were upheld in favour of the client, which means basically 2/3 of the complaints were not really genuine complaints. And it was accepted that the recommendation from the advisor was correct. And finally, and this is, as I would expect, personal pensions and normal pensions that most people look at, they only received 46 complaints, which is negligible, and 41% were upheld, because there's not too much you can complain about in a personal pension. It's normally about the advisor rather than the product. Okay, so they're the numbers. They're not good numbers. I mean, any number is too bad. And if you're one of the 2,606 or one of the 166 complainants that had a resolution, you're probably still not happy with that situation. I wouldn't want to be one of those people either. So what is mis-sold? Well, first of all, not a pension. Pensions are not mis-sold. Generally, it's a good decision to have a pension. Putting money away for later on is a good idea. Nobody could argue that fact. It is a good idea. What is wrong, where we look at mis-sold, are certain things have been inappropriate. First of all, an inappropriate option. First of those would be opting out of the employer scheme, being encouraged by an advisor, and I don't think this happens, but I'm not saying it wouldn't happen ever, where you're in an employer scheme and they say opt out of that and we'll set you up a personal scheme, whether that's a SIPP or a personal pension or something else, doesn't matter. Opting out of the employer scheme, usually not the best idea. Secondly, transferring from defined benefit, also known as DB or final salary schemes, again, not necessarily a bad thing, but it has to be appropriate for the individual. So every individual case is different. You can't just assume that all defined benefits should be transferred. Not the case. In fact, 90% of them shouldn't be. The final bit is inappropriate investment. And this doesn't just apply to pensions. This applies to anything. If you've got an ISA, or if you've got an investment bond, or anything like that, choosing an inappropriate investment or the advisor recommending an inappropriate investment is the problem. First of all, what makes it inappropriate doesn't meet your attitude to risk, your risk profile. If you're a relatively cautious person, you shouldn't be invested in very volatile investment markets. If you're a very adventurous investor, we shouldn't be investing your funds in very cautious bonds and things. So it's making the investment appropriate, and that applies to applies to pensions, because obviously that's, for most people, is their biggest investment option. The other thing is misrepresentation, probably the biggest issue. And I'll come to all of those in a minute. So just give you misleading information, so you sign up for something that's not really appropriate for you. So let's look at those as we go along. So first of all, the workplace pension, your employer's pension, also nowadays known as auto-enrollment, because every company has a company pension. And every company must pay at least a 3% contribution into your pension. So if you opt out of that, first problem is you've lost their contribution. It's very hard for you to make up an extra 3% in growth to make it worth you doing that. So never ever opt out of your employer's pension in favour of something else. No matter how bad the pension is, it could be the worst pension in the world, it's still giving you 3% for nothing. Many company schemes actually are paying more than 3%. Many employers pay 5%. Many employers match your contributions up to a level. So every scheme is slightly different, but the minimum you would pay is 3%. So that's worth having from your employer because it's free money for you. Also, the investment charges are very competitive. There's legislation that says a company pension scheme cannot charge more than a certain amount. There's no legislation of that type in any other sort of pension. So whilst some pensions are lower cost than others and some funds are lower cost than others, you can't guarantee it without looking into small print. You know that for a fact, your company scheme. So stick with that. And by all means, if you're going to contribute more than your employer scheme allows with them contribute matching, then the excess you may consider somewhere else, but not the initial thing. So don't opt out, do the bit you have to do, comply with the rules for the company scheme, and then if you want to do extra, decide whether the company scheme or a separate scheme is the best option. An advisor will help you with that, but they won't. Any advice that tells you opt out of the company scheme, walk away from. DB transfers, defined benefit transfers. First of all, let's explain what they are. A guaranteed pension. You are told today how much your pension will be when you retire. It's guaranteed. It also has spousal benefits, like benefits for your wife or husband. If you stay in the scheme, it guarantees them what they will get if something happens to you. Guaranteed. There's no investment risk. You're not investing your money. The company are doing whatever they want to do with the pension scheme. You're not taking that risk. So there's no investment risk. Your benefits are guaranteed. There's also no investment costs. So you're not paying investment charges as you would do on a personal pension. And so these are the things that if all of those things are important to you, you shouldn't define benefit transfer at all. But an advisor's job is to make sure that they've discussed all those options and weighed up those against the benefits and risks of transferring to a personal pension arrangement, whether it's a SIPP or anything else. So first thing is, if it's appropriate for you to keep all those guaranteed benefits, then the discussion should go no further. And that's really when a missold, if somebody persuades you that the other option's better, then you might be straying into the missold area. Okay, so they're the two types of missold pension areas. So the main thing is investment choices. Biggest issue here is higher risk than suits you. You know, if you're an average person with an average attitude to investment, and we have to ascertain that by asking you, filling in questionnaires and getting a feel for what other investments you have, what experience you have, what knowledge you have of investments, etc. And many people are totally inexperienced. The only investment they have is their pension. So we mustn't go any further than the fact they don't really know that much about investments. So we shouldn't bamboozle you with clever things about investments. So the higher risk could be something like shares totally in companies in China. Well, we don't really know that much about the companies. It's very potentially going to give big returns, but also potentially big losses, could go completely wrong, and there's nothing balancing it out, so that would be wrong for you. Other thing to watch out for is unrealistic returns promised. So any scheme that says guarantee 10%, walk away. It is not true. Nothing can guarantee a return. We can guarantee a minimum protection. We can guarantee that funds won't go below a certain figure because there's a guarantee built in, but the charges would reflect that, so your growth rate would be lower. But we cannot guarantee a fixed return of any kind. And if we said that, we're lying, and that's where you missold. You also may be led to believe that you'll double your money in 12 months, you can have your money back, no problem. Don't believe it. It's not true. Could also be invested non-ethically. So you might have certain views and values that you want taken into account, and therefore you've been missold if your investment doesn't match that. And we can invest to suit most people's ethical stance. So again, missold, not just pensions, any investment applies to. Not FSCS protected, the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. this is probably a big one specific to SIPPs as opposed to personal pensions. A SIPP is a self-invested personal pension. The SI bit makes the difference, self-invested, and that means you chose to invest that way. Nobody recommended it, theoretically. Whilst you might have been persuaded to sign up for it by an advisor, I use that term loosely, the investment itself was your choice. It potentially could be that it's no longer protected by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. So it goes wrong, you lose your money. Whereas a normal pension fund that is protected by the FSCS scheme will cover your investment against disasters befalling the company, not the investments itself. So if you have shares in Tesco's and Tesco's go kaput, you still lose your Tesco shares. But if you have a pension with Aviva and Aviva goes kaput, your fund is still protected by the FSCS, unless it's specifically not protected, and that's typically in a SIPP, they're not protected. You'll also find that charges tend to be higher in a SIPP in particular, some personal pensions as well, where the fund managers are charging perhaps anything up to 2%, 2.25%, whereas your workplace scheme, come back to that, would be no more than 0.75% a year. Your financial advisor could be charging excessive fees as well, because they can add their fees to the scheme. Depending on the size of investment, you should normally see 2 to 3% initial charges. I've seen as much as high as 8%. So again, that's not really missold, but it's a little bit unethical, I would say, and a bit unfair on you because it's wiping out any growth you might have made. But that's really where we are. We're not really talking missold SIPP. Very few people are missold. This is more about missold investment. So you might be, I don't know, perhaps we've chosen to, let's talk to you about this building hotel in Dubai. You've got it's a one-off transaction. You've got no way of knowing whether that's genuine or not. It's not protected. It's outside the UK. It has all sorts of risks. It's not, you should be very wary, and those sort of things for most people would be inappropriate. So that would be where missold. And mis-selling, as I say, is either, so in summary, is either choosing an inappropriate option, so moving you out of an employer scheme, or transferring out of a defined benefit or final salary scheme when your attitude to investments would make that inappropriate. The benefits of doing so would be wrong for you. And finally, it's inappropriate investment, an investment that's not right for you. And that's the only time you're missold. So many people think they're missold because it's performed badly. That's not the case. Investments can perform badly. Usually, we put on every investment key features document, you'll see the little box at the bottom that normally says, warning, your investments may fall as well as rise. Past performance is not a guarantee of future performance. And we have to be true. You have to look at the situation in the world at the moment where the stock markets around the world have collapsed because of COVID-19. Your investments in those stock markets, you've just lost a load of money. Temporarily, I might add, and it will go back up again. But if you complain about that loss, you've got nothing to complain for. That's why, I mean, a lot of the complaints made to FOS, they're the sort of thing people complain about, and they've been told they can't complain about that because it's not a complaint. That's just risk you have taken by investing. You have to be able to prove that we led you down the garden path a bit into the wrong sort of investment. And that would be very hard in many cases to prove, particularly in a self-invested personal pension, because the argument is you self-invested. And on that note, just be wary of any advisor trying to get you to sign a disclaimer saying you chose the investment. If they're not recommending it, there's a reason they're not recommending. And if they're not recommending it, it means you're not protected because you chose it, and they've got to get out of jail card when it goes wrong because you can't complain to them. All right? So that's me for today. Just bear that in mind. I hope that was useful, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next recording. Good day for now.